afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, this is Redberry Will here, and welcome back to one of my Learn to Lead videos. Today's video will be talking about Chapter 6, which is the human element. If you have not previously checked out my earlier content, please feel free to check it out in the iCard, and if you're ready, let's buckle up and jump straight into it. The first part of the chapter talks about personality, where personality comes from and what personality is. Personality is defined as an individual's thoughts, behaviors, and actions that create who they are. And scientists argue whether it's nature versus nurture that creates who a person is. Nature is essentially their innate nature, or what they are born with is their personality. And then nurture is how the environment shapes that person over time. There is a principle of the blank slate theory, where a human is born with a blank slate, or their mind is completely blank. And this is a philosophy that was from the ancient Greek philosophers. And basically, over time, over your entire lifetime, things are written onto that slate that make you who you are. There's also the nurture aspect, which is that like your environment makes you who you are. So like your parents and different influential figures, or like your living conditions if you're in a really wealthy family or not in such great conditions, that can also shape who you are. And it's determined that it's a mixture of both. Both have enormous influence over who you become, and so the two of them work together to make you, you. Though leaders cannot change someone's nature, or like human nature in general, they can influence the environment for positive changes in their community or organization. The next thing that the chapter talks about is birth order theory. And birth order theory is that depending on what place you were in terms of your family and your brothers and sisters, where in that order you were born, can determine if you are a leader. So, for example, if someone was a firstborn child, they might be more likely to lead because they're more extroverted and they have to lead the other kids in the family. However, birth order doesn't necessarily have to do with if you can lead or not. It just has some advantages because when you're growing up, you have to take on that leadership role and you're thrust into that position from an early age. Charisma is how magnetic someone's personality might be in order to put them into a leadership position or be more effective as a leader. There are some times where a leader is charismatic and then they don't have the experience to back it up, and then you might see some dissonance between whether or not you would want to follow such a person. For example, if Joe Schmo over here is fantastic with his charisma and he's like, yeah, I'm here for the people, except he doesn't put in the time and effort to respond to emails or set a direction for his organization, then people may not necessarily want to follow him, even though he has the charisma. So in order to back up the charisma, you have to put in time and effort into a position that you're in. Self-perception is a very important aspect to leadership because in order to understand how to lead other people, you have to understand yourself and how to follow, right? We talked about this early on. You have to be a follower before you can become a leader. And by understanding how you learn, how you react to your environment, and strengths or challenges that you may have, you can be a more effective leader. A method to evaluate yourself through self-perception is the Johari Window. There are 4 sections to the Johari Window, and each section tells yourself a little bit about who you are and what other people perceive about you, and what you may not necessarily know about yourself. So there's public, blind, private, and unknown. And each of these 4 sections are whether you know it yourself or others know it about you. So known, publicly, would be you yourself know it and others also know about it. Blind is where other people know about it, but you don't necessarily know about it. Private is where you know about it, but others don't know about it. And unknown is that nobody knows about it. For example, if you're leading a flight and you're confident and you are really charismatic as you are leading them in drill, then that is public that you are confident in that you know drill. And then other people and yourself know your confidence in drill. But something that might be more private is that there's a specific drill maneuver that you're not familiar with, and even though you're putting on a facade of being confident, you really don't know what you're doing and you're just trying to go through the moves. Or you may not be as proficient as people think you are, so that would be a private part of the Johari window. So something to watch out for is when you're a leader and there are blind spots in accordance to the Johari window, and your followers know a weakness of yours and you yourself do not. And by building an environment of trust and respect, you can establish if there is something that's going on, then you can have an open door policy and your followers can come talk to you. In which case, then those items that might be in your blind spot will become known to you, and it'll be public, but then you'd be able to make improvements on whatever it is that you're working on. So then there's the Myers-Briggs personality inventory. I do have a small caveat to discuss here. Personality is fluid over time. And when you take the Myers-Briggs test, it does not tell you definitively what your personality is. It depends on the circumstances that you're taking the test, what mental state you're in, what kind of environment you're in, that determines how your responses are. Each item is a different scale on like extroversion versus introversion, intuition versus sensing, thinking, feeling, judging, or perceiving, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. There is a personality theory called the Big Five trait theory, which is a little bit more concrete on what personality is, and it does talk about extroversion and introversion, but just think of the Myers-Briggs test as a normal curve. Most people are going to fall in the middle of that curve, whether it's a little bit more extroverted and a little bit more introverted. And depending on the day, you might be feeling more social than others, so you might be more on the extroverted side, even though you feel energized by being by yourself. So in that instance, like it's just like temporary, here's how you're feeling right now at this moment. So I'm just going to put that out there. But all you need to really know is that there are 16 personality types within the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, and if you want to use this, it's an okay tool for evaluating your personality traits, but it doesn't necessarily reflect what your long-term personality traits truly are. Next, I'm going to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you don't necessarily need to understand everything in depth, but it's important to understand that basic needs should normally be fulfilled first before moving on to higher levels. So the first one is physiological needs. So if someone needs food, if they need water, if they need to go to the bathroom, then any of those things, those typically need to be met before you can move on to higher levels. So if someone is really, really hungry, they're not going to be an effective follower because they're more focused on, when am I getting food next? I need my food. Versus, yes, let me rappel down this tower and help my teammates succeed. Next is safety needs. So if someone's safety needs are not being met, then they may not have a roof over their head, or they might feel like they're in danger. And by eliminating uncertainty or potential dangers, then that level is being met. The next level is community or sense of belonging. So if you don't feel like you're a part of a team, you're less likely to want to contribute to it than if you do feel like you're part of a team or that you feel important. And as a leader, you want to be able to empower your people to make them feel like they are important, and so they take that personal initiative to help support the team as much as they can. The next part is, or the next level I should say, is esteem needs. You need to feel good about yourself and what you're doing in order to effectively do it. Sometimes there are cases where you don't necessarily have to feel good about what you're doing in order to get stuff done, but in most cases, people in a more positive mental state and more confidence in their abilities will effectively get their job done rather than someone who may not be. So if you are not motivated to get your homework done, for example, and that's because you don't know how to do it, like, I have this Algebra 2 assignment and I don't know how to do it, then you are not going to have that confidence in order to complete the task, and you might even procrastinate. And I talked about procrastination in an earlier video. So if you have higher esteem in yourself and your abilities, and your followers have high esteem, in their abilities, then your team will be able to accomplish its mission better. Self-actualization is meeting full potential, where essentially you can do anything, and your followers can do anything. If you meet self-actualization, which is pretty challenging as compared to like what nirvana is, it's pretty challenging to get to, and most people get to the self-esteem is fulfilled, and they're constantly working towards self-actualization as they get older, but it's very, very challenging to get to. So there's something discussed called the Hawthorne Studies, where essentially people in a workplace were asked if certain lights were working for their workplace, or if they should change the lights. And this is a good example of paying attention to people in order to increase trust and performance within the organization. An example of this is the CAC, in that the Cadet Advisory Council, the CAC, is asking the cadets in Civil Air Patrol areas for improvement, feedback, thoughts, and ideas, and this further empowers the cadets in general to instill change within the organization. Some states have more active CACs than others, and the national one is definitely instilling changes, like through adding the new achievement names, or at least the most recent achievement names, and the PT testing that is similar to the Presidential Fitness Award as opposed to different standards. Next, I'm going to talk about classical conditioning, and if you're familiar with this, then you'd probably know Pavlov and his dogs. Essentially, Pavlov had a stimulus, or food, and it was paired with something completely unrelated, like the ringing of a bell. And the dogs paired, whenever they hear the bell, then they will receive food. And in response to that, the dogs would salivate whenever they heard the bell. So it was a conditioned response to the bell being rung, even though originally it didn't have a connection to food. He taught them, he conditioned them to connect the two together, and so they would salivate. And so every time that bell would be rung, even if they didn't necessarily get food, they would then start to think, food is coming. So this is something that you could use as a teaching technique. It's kind of difficult to do, like as an example here, but you can use it as a teaching tool by understanding that you can pair a stimulus with a desired behavior, and you can reinforce positive behaviors through some of those techniques. Now, there is something called operant conditioning, where you might have positive or negative reinforcement. The book doesn't go into it, but I'll talk about it a little bit. Positive reinforcement is where you're adding something to increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring. So, like, if you give me a solid hand salute, I'll give you 5 cents. And so every time you salute me well, I'll give you that nickel. That would be positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement would be taking something unpleasant away so that you continue to do that positive behavior. And then there's positive punishment, which it doesn't necessarily mean, oh yes, it's a good punishment. It means that you are giving someone something as a punishment. So I might give you a stinky sock and say, here's your stinky sock because you did this bad thing. Then that would be me giving a positive punishment. A negative punishment would be taking something away so that you stop a behavior. Like a small child, if they're not going to sleep properly, an angry parent might take away their toy and say, you're not getting this back until you sleep. And that's negative punishment by taking something away. So in the context of reinforcement and punishment, positive is referred to the giving of it, and negative is referred to the taking away of it, whether it be reinforcement or punishment. There is a study called the Milgram Experiment, where essentially the participants were told to shock someone if they weren't following what the instructions were properly. And of course, they weren't actually shocking other people, but this is an ethically questionable experiment because of the psychological harm that it could have done on the participants. Nowadays, most most studies would never do such a thing, and it's really hard to get the review board's approval for such a human experiment. But in that study, it showed how authority of the doctor had some influence over the participants who were shocking their partner, who it wasn't actually shocking their partner, but it was someone who knew about the experiment ahead of time and were just like responding as if they were getting shocked. It also showed how followers want to do as much as they can to impress their leaders, or like in that instance the doctor, in order to show, hey, I'm performing effectively. This is something that I'm doing. I hope I'm doing the right thing. And sometimes that can be a good thing, sometimes that can be a bad thing. It shows that obedience to authority can be a huge motivator in some instances, especially when the participant or the follower is not familiar with the situation. Defense mechanisms created by Sigmund Freud are essentially how a person might protect themselves from psychological injury, or it might just be a normal behavior. And there's a massive list of them, which I'll be going over briefly over a few of them today. Displacement is when you redirect your feelings from one thing to another. So for example, if your boss starts yelling at you when you're at work, and then you go home, you might go yell at your pet turtle because the turtle is less threatening than yelling back at your boss, and you don't want to get fired. Projection is where you're attributing the problem to someone else rather than on yourself. So let's say I am self-conscious about my hair length. Then I might say, her haircut is just awful. She must be so self-conscious about it. Even though I myself, I'm not saying I am, but in this example, if I were self-conscious about my hair, and then I'm projecting that onto someone else, then that would be an example of what the projection defense mechanism is. Intellectualization is removing the emotional side of anything from a situation or a psychological phenomenon that you're experiencing. So let's say Timmy's grandmother died. He might just look at it and say, she is no longer on this earth with us, and that is that. Rather than being sad or angry or in any kind of emotion, he might just remove himself from that emotion and be like, nope, I'm not feeling it. And it's not necessarily a conscious decision that he might be making, but it might be an unconscious decision that his mind is just like, I am not going to emotionally process this at this time. And in those situations, it's normally good to talk to a therapist in order to work through those situations and have emotional clarity moving forward. Denial is the failure to acknowledge a fact, even if it's commonly accepted by others. So for example, the Earth is round. There are people out there who deny that the Earth is round. Even though they have done tests themselves that prove that the Earth is round, they still deny it. So that is the denial defense mechanism. Suppression is where you take those feelings, bottle them up, and you completely just push them down and push them out, and you're setting aside any anxiety or problems. So let's say there's a very stressful homework assignment that is due very, very, very soon, and instead of being like, oh my gosh, I need to get this done right now, oh no, I don't have time to finish it, it's due tomorrow night at midnight. Someone who might be suppressing it might be like, it's okay, I'm gonna go play some video games. Though it might be very fun to play some video games, and it's very nice and relaxing, suppressing that anxiety can not end well, especially if it comes to completing that homework assignment in time, and you're suppressing those feelings rather than addressing those feelings directly. Withdrawal is removing oneself from others or anything that reminds them from pain. So for example, if someone broke up with their boyfriend and there was a certain song playing in the background, they may completely avoid that song or that artist because of the memories that it reminds them of. Next, I'm going to talk about managing conflict, which involves interpersonal skills. Interpersonal skills is the skill to be able to communicate and interact effectively with other people, and conflict management is where we are able to overcome problems or challenges between us, others, and the environment. There is a mnemonic that I have for conflict management styles, which is a dense chasm. There's avoidance, denial, suppression, compromise, zero-sum, and mediation. or a third-party one. Avoidance is where one chooses not to engage the other party. Denial is when you don't want to even acknowledge that there is some kind of conflict. Suppression is when doesn't see it as bad as it may actually be. Compromise is an attempt to create a win-win scenario for both parties. Zero-sum is when there's only win and lose terms. And mediation is where a third party gets involved in order to help come to a conclusion with the conflict. Whenever there's a conflict, the changes should always be on the individual behaviors and not the individuals themselves. Because if it focuses on the behaviors that need to be changed or addressed, then there's more likely for a positive change. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is prejudice and harassment, which is unnecessary and unfair behaviors towards a specific individual or group of people. And there are several different ways that you can fight against the hate, which I will show you my hand signals that I have created for it. So it's rise up, come together, or pull together, speak up, support victims, and teach tolerance. And those are the 5 ways you can fight against hate. That is everything that I have for this video. Again, if you watched all the way through it, you're amazing, first of all. And if you have not read through the books, please read through the books. Please, please. I can't teach everything, but I'm doing my best. So thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. And that is all, folks. Until next time, toodles.